Welcome to Therapy Sessions Cutting Toxic Family Ties. My name is Dr. Sherry Campbell, and I'm your host. I am a leading expert in the niche of toxic family abuse, and although my show cannot substitute for therapy, it is a survivor-based show. In me, you're not only going to get an expert, but you're also going to get a survivor, as I have also survived toxic family abuse. I know how hard it is. The goal I have is to give voice to the voiceless, to provide skills to help you to protect your peace, to stand your solid ground, and to navigate and heal the heartbreaks caused by toxic family. Please have a pen and paper available to give voice to your thoughts as you listen to each show. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for your bravery. So let the healing begin. Welcome back, everyone, to Therapy Sessions Cutting Toxic Family Ties. Okay, you guys, this woman is one of my favorite human beings in the whole world. We've actually never met until today personally, but we have found each other on social media, and she is also in the field of toxic family. And I had to have her on because of this one concept that she talks about that's mentioned in a lot of my books, but she unpacks it so deeply. So please introduce yourself to my following and tell us all about you for just a minute. How did you get into toxic family dynamics? All the things.
Yeah, great question. So I'm Dr. Denise. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Beverly Hills, where I have a private practice. Throughout my training, I always wanted to focus on trauma. And I don't know if this was your experience, but you don't get a lot of that in your training. I think I maybe had more systems approach in my master's training, but it's something that's completely left out. And I think as I went through my trauma training, I always was pulled back to childhood, focusing on childhood abuse. And I think something that happens for a lot of clinicians, myself included, is that the longer you're in the field, the more you become kind of an authentic version of yourself as a clinician, where you're merging a lot of your lived experience with your clinical expertise a lot more. And I think that's partly what happened for me, where all of my training just kept pulling me back to this area that is so impactful. Like, we cannot look at an individual existing outside of their system, especially when we're talking about trauma. So for me, it just became, I think as I've become more authentic, and you can even see it on my social media, like there's phases of my social media of what I'm talking about that have really aligned with my own healing, especially in my work in private practice. I can't talk with someone about what they're experiencing, how they're suffering, the things they struggle with, without talking about how they exist, the roles that they exist in their own family systems. And the lack of, I'm sure you see this too, the lack of vocabulary and education that so many of us have had around those things, especially if they come from families and generations and cultures where things are just normalized. Unless you have someone really guiding you to explore things, not with the intent of blame, but with the intent of understanding impact, it's really hard to do our individual work. So for me, it's just been kind of like a full circle, because I've done my own work and allowing myself to be more seen and more authentic as a clinician and as a human being.
I love that, because when I was going through my training, I always say this, and this is no offense to any of the training of a PhD. I mean, it couldn't be better, but it didn't help me with any livable part of my life. It did not help me be articulate to my pain.
Yeah.
It did not give any voice to, family systems. You understand the system, but it really is like a water bug. It just sits on top of the water, but it doesn't muddy the pond. It doesn't really go into what happens if you're the identified patient. It just sort of defines it. It's a part of the system, and this is how it functions, but it doesn't dive into the muddy water. It doesn't muddy the water. And so I do think that the education for both of us was a big growing experience. I think too, I came out feeling like I had to be very clinical. Um, you couldn't hug your patients. You can't self-share. I don't follow any of those rules because I think it's inhumane. If someone comes into my office absolutely on their face broken and they need a hug, I will give them a hug.
Yeah.
If sharing my story helps another person feel seen, then I will share aspects of my story. I'm certainly clued into when that's appropriate and when it's not. But I wouldn't want to go to a therapist who was not sharing anything about her. From my trauma, I wouldn't trust that.
Yeah.
I want to know the person that I'm sitting across from enough to know if they can help me.
Yeah.
Right. So I feel like it's so true that you go through the education piece of it and then you evolve into something else, right? Were you raised in a toxic family?
I was. I was. Um, and just for anyone listening, I am still connected to my family, so I will be mindful of what I share. But yeah, absolutely, generational trauma on both sides. Um, the dysfunction that trickled down is absolutely still there.
Yeah, I want to differentiate before we dive in because I do think that I'm in the only 14% of people that had two very sociopathic
Yeah.
parents. They aren't your emotionally immature parent where there's a lack of, like an emotional intelligence where they're doing things and they're not really conscious of the fact that it's selfish or hurtful. And in those dynamics, I think you should continue to maintain relationships. When you're someone like me, if I wanted to survive, I had to save my life. I had to save my life. I could not function in that type of sadistic abuse where anything that was coming my way, I had to think very deeply about if I respond like this, that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's bad. If I respond like that, that'll happen. That's bad. There was no way. So I think that no contact should always be a last option. I accidentally started this no contact movement and did not know that I was starting a movement. I was cut off. So I just ran out of tools, time, energy, and motivation to continue to mend the fence, right? But I'm glad that you are still in contact because I think it's important for my listeners to know that there are in between people and that abuse is on a continuum and it's up to each individual. I've never, ever once encouraged anyone to go no contact, but I do support it 100% if it's necessary.
I'm so glad you're saying this. And, I'm sure you get this on your social media too, but sometimes you see the toxic personalities come out of the woodwork when you post certain
Oh
things.
my Lord, yes. They hate me.
But you see people, I think people are truly grappling often with the degrees of severity because very rarely is something clearly black and white. There are absolutely cases where that, like in yours, where things belong in a very specific box. But I do see people grappling with the complexity of it and, wondering like, are we not giving this person the benefit of the doubt, this and that? And I think it is really important to recognize there are categories and each of those categories is a continuum, but there are categories of people as parents, right? Where there's these, what we have on the extreme end, like you're describing your lived experience. And on the other end, we have, flawed human beings, regular parents, and everything
right.
in between. And
Absolutely.
if you're on that end of the spectrum, this conversation is probably less applicable to you. The things that you and I are posting are probably less applicable to you. But for those who are closer to that continuum of emotionally immature, narcissistic, all the way to sociopathic, there is not information recently there's a lot more, but hasn't been a lot of information readily available for people to name those experiences, to validate it, to give voice to it, and to also support people in navigating it. So if that's not you, there's no therapist or movement here trying to say this applies to you, this is for all parents. We're talking about a very specific type of family, a very specific type of personality and individual.
And I think the reason it's so triggering is because we are now giving these labels to family. All of these labels were fine and acceptable when it wasn't, and still we can say that Ted Bundy was a sociopath, right? And that's fine, because look at Ted Bundy, that makes complete sense. But we don't want to attribute these titles, narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, dependent, antisocial, amoral, passive aggressive, to anyone that is not a friend or a love relationship or a boss or a coworker. The second you put these labels onto the people in a family, you get an eruption of that. So we're not really allowed to talk about the problematic character of our family, but especially parents, in a culturally open and safe space, which is how so many people like myself and you didn't want to. I just didn't talk about it. And in fact, I was so convinced it was me that it was so masterful in making me feel like it was me. And I kept trying to be good and chasing that carrot for 4.5 decades. And how will you know? This is a question I get all the time. To me, it was a feeling, not a knowing. I just knew. I knew that I couldn't mend the fence ever again one more time, because now I was being accused of being a monster over things I didn't do. I was in relationships where my parents were getting mad at me for things they did. So I was like, I just couldn't do it anymore. Everything in me was done. And then I was terrorized for 4 years by them after, right? But the one thing that I love about your work, and I just love everything about you. I love your voice. You have such a graceful, soothing way about you. And I think you're so approachable and so, you just feel so soft and smart and all of these beautiful things. And when you talk about being seen, talk about that with my following. I always talk about we need to be heard, loved, understood, and we need time, love, and attention, right? So I had such a different experience of being seen, but I want you to give the healthy version of what that is. And then we'll dive into the unhealthy version. And maybe as we come together as you and I, we can sort of, help the following with, how do you get through this piece, or how can you heal it? Right. So tell us about being seen.
Yeah. So I love that you talk about those kind of necessary ingredients. And to be seen is not just physically being seen, right? That's of course important, but being seen is more about the things that we can't physically observe. It's being seen emotionally. It's being seen for the unique aspects of who you are as an individual, your gifts, your expressions, all the things that make you unique, all the things that make you authentically you. And I firmly believe that is such an important ingredient just of secure attachment, even from when we're infants, to be seen. We've done all these studies about how a parent's ability to sense and respond appropriately to a child is incredibly important for connection, but for the building blocks of emotion regulation. So this idea of being seen is something it's not just this lovely luxury. It's like this biological imperative. And I think for us as human beings, I talk about this on social media, that it is one of the closest things to feeling loved. It truly is, because even as an adult, you can think about an experience you've had. Hopefully everyone's had at least one of these in their life that they can pinpoint. But if you're talking to someone, you're sharing something, no matter how vulnerable, and someone does something or says something that indicates to you that you are understood, you are accepted, and like you're allowed to take up space with whatever it is that you're sharing or expressing or presenting out into the world, what that does for you.
Mm-hmm.
It is a sense of ease in the body. It is expansion. It is alignment and authenticity. Like you feel it not just emotionally, but you feel it in your body. And as a child, as a young child, when your parent sees you, and I'm not talking about perfect attunement here. We know that's not necessary for secure attachment. I have little ones. I'm a flawed parent. I understand this. Yeah. But when we have regular attunement and repairs, when we inevitably misattune, that communicates to us that we are loved. And our sense of being loved is directly tied to feeling like you are going to survive. Because historically, if as an infant you were not seen and loved, you were not taken care of, provided for, nurtured, you were not going to survive. So it sounds like this really kind of fluffy concept, but there is this really deep biological piece to it where when I don't feel seen, and we can get into the unhealthy part, but when I don't feel seen, it is so incredibly threatening on a visceral level.
It really is, because I think that first year of life, we're a biological organism. We are in trust versus mistrust. If you cry, do your caregivers figure out what you need, and do they meet the need, right? If you think about breastfeeding, an infant only has a 6 to 12-inch audiovisual gaze, which is designed perfectly for breastfeeding, right? So it is all based on this biological, pre-verbal, precognitive being feeling safe, right? Feeling that if they get the reward of I cried and I got a need met, I got held, I got fed, I got changed, whatever it is. And then you develop trust, right? So I think on a biological level, that is necessary. You're right. It's not fluffy. We aren't dealing with we have a fetus. We birth a fetus. We don't, not like a baby horse where it's woohoo and it's, walking, or a cheetah where it stays with its mom for a week and then it's out doing its own thing. We have 18 years at a minimum of helping the child become the thing. And if you start off with trust, then that child is fundamentally going to be more successful throughout the other stages of life. So when I was young, let's get into the other side of this. Being seen was excruciating because everything about me that wasn't liked was pointed out. So I was seen, but I wanted to be invisible.
Yeah.
I was fat. I wasn't smart. I was to be around. I was in the way. I wanted too much. And I had this other level of being seen in that my sibling was adored, different sexes, and it was over exaggerated. And there was being seen like, see, I can give this and I'm not going to give it to you.
Yeah.
So for me, being seen was so painful that I didn't want to be seen. And I found ways to disappear. I lived in a beautiful area. Thank God the area was so gorgeous. I was in another state that was all mountains and whatnot. So I would get outside and I would have little friends in the neighborhood and whatnot. And I would be away because coming home, being seen always felt so bad. And this would be, of course, 90% of the time.
Yeah.
I would get doses of feeling, I'd get a love bomb here and there. But I hated being seen because I felt decrepit. I felt ugly. I felt like I was an embarrassment or a burden. And in comparison to someone who was being seen.
Yep. In a safe way.
So that to me was like horrible. And I ended up at my teenage years being very angry and I'm like, if this is how they think I am, then fuck it. I'll go be all the things. And I got very rebellious, very angry, all the things. And then I disappeared into anorexia and I became dead silent and pretty and thin. And then I was not really validated for that, but it would made my life a little more peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
And I was obsessed with me being good or bad based on food rather than her or my dad. So on top of that, there were 9 marriages between my parents, and I had to be seen by step parents. And I wasn't functioning well through all these changes. And that was hard. Then I was an elite athlete, and that being seen got me bullied. So for me, my experience of being seen was nothing of what is in the literature about being seen. Now, I see my daughter in all the ways of love and connection and safety. And I'm so lucky that I have her. She is such an angel. But being seen for me was like being terrorized. It wasn't a good feeling. And I think a lot of survivors have that experience.
Absolutely.
And it's made me very introverted. We talked a little bit about that prior. Here I am a public figure and I don't like being seen. Right. And so I'm forced outside of my comfort zone all the time. And I think it's going to travel with me for my life. I think that feeling of discomfort in being seen. So it's like there's a part of you that really wants it.
Absolutely.
But if I get it, I used to feel guilty. Or I would be like, you don't really have to compliment me. Like, just tell me what you want.
Yeah.
Right. So not trusting because of that trust versus mistrust. Absolutely. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, so many thoughts. Thank you for sharing a little bit of that context. I think that, as you're talking, thinking about, again, back to kind of these categories of experience, I think there are people who may have had such an experience of neglect, where it's physical or emotional, where you may actually not be seen, like you are unimportant. You are maybe someone who's more in the role of the invisible child, may have that experience of being seen in terms of the lack of it, the absence of being seen. And of course, you can have a mixed experience, especially if you have a narcissistic parent.
Yeah, I would have killed to be invisible.
Right. And then you have the experience of being seen, but it is unsafe to be seen, whether it comes with criticism, judgment, shame, punishment, jealousy, retaliation, right? All those things. And I do think for many kids who grow up with a narcissistic parent, they get the whole spectrum of that they get experiences of neglect, where who they are as a person, because they are unseen, because the narcissist is so much in their own experience, there's no appreciation for who the child is, and there's no encouragement to nurture that or explore that, because we develop that self-concept by being mirrored from that parent. So you can have that kind of lack of being seen in that experience, but then you can also, especially I think as children go into adolescence, you become more of a threat to that narcissistic parent, especially if you start gaining a little bit of, developmentally appropriate autonomy, or you do have talents or gifts, or you do start expressing yourself more naturally as adolescents do. Then you're a threat to the system. You're a threat to the attention and the supply that parent is getting from their own children. Your competition now. So many different variations of what it could mean to be seen, but that be unsafe. And then if you throw on top of that experiences of bullying, right? Things outside the home, experiences of bullying, racial discrimination based on gender identity. I mean, all sorts of things that might compile on top of whatever you got at home. And it does create this sense of wanting to completely disappear. Right? If I am invisible, if I am unseen, or the kind of socially acceptable version that so many of us fall into is like, if I just abandon myself and take care of everyone else. And all of us people pleasers, all of us caretakers,
That's right.
how many therapists?
Yes.
If I step into this role where I'm making sure you're okay,
Yeah.
right? One, that helps me be invisible. I'm no longer a threat, but it also feels, as long as you're okay, then I'm safe, right? If you're happy, you're regulated, then I'm safe. So the idea of being seen, and like, I love the example you're sharing. It's like, here I am, this public figure, and I'm doing
Yeah.
it, right? It's like we're literally bumping up against our nervous system and these parts of us that develop to try to keep us safe. We're just like constantly telling us to stay small, to stay
Yeah.
quiet.
Yeah.
And, it's really, from my view, it's so important that we honor those so much.
Yeah, I think so too. And I was even pre-seen. So let me explain that. So my mom was smearing me from birth.
Mm.
So even before I would enter into a new grade, I was already judged
Yeah.
by teachers because I grew up in a very small town. So there were 60 kids in my whole grade. And we have the superstar sibling and the train wreck daughter. And I was already pre-seen.
Yeah.
So I could feel like I would walk in and it would be like they'd have their eye on me
Mm.
because I was bad. So everywhere that I was looking, I was facing this this attunement with a narrative about me that wasn't real, but I didn't have any no there was no way for me to filter through that and figure that out. So then I was grotesquely insecure and very people pleasing. My belief was, if you're happy, then I can be happy. And I got used and abused. And it took me a long time to rid myself of the people pleasing habit because it was my source of safety. I was not at all connected to myself. I would observe other people because this is how I grew up. Like, can I do Piggy Go Market with my dad today? Or no, I can't. No, he's violent today. The mom would come home and I'd have to measure what kind of mood are we in, and I would mold myself or try to mold myself around that until I got my prefrontal cortex shut down on a high dopamine as a teenager. And then I was like, I was like totally rebellious. When I got away from home and I went to college, I cried for 2 years nonstop. No idea even why I was crying because I didn't know myself as well as I needed to. But I think I could finally let stuff out. But I actually thought I was insane because I'm like, no, none of my friends are doing this. Like
Yeah.
I'm constantly crying from the depths of this black pit of I don't even know what it is. Right. So I couldn't see myself because I didn't know myself. I was a mimic of everything else. I lived my life on that with no identity. So then as I was getting older and people were like, oh, you just need to love yourself. I was like, I don't even,
What is
well,
that?
that's offensive. Okay. Because I don't even know what love is to go do that. Right. So I had to get to know myself to love myself. I've talked on many shows about I searched high and low personality tests, all the things, but at a very young age. And so I evolved in some ways really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think in hindsight, pulling into myself the way that I had to kind of disappear, it did bring me into a private world with myself
Yeah.
where I did have a very vivid imagination. Like I loved Little Orphan Annie. I loved all these girls, Pippi Longstocking, that were all alone without parents, but strong and fearless. And, I thank God for some of these things that were out there and that I wrote in a journal because I
Absolutely.
could write myself back into existence. I never thought about it was me writing back to me.
Mm.
It was almost as if as if I was had this parent in this book.
Yeah.
But as I got older, I realized like I'm doing that for me. That's me writing back to me. That's me finding myself and writing myself back into existence against this narrative, right? So I think that being seen as we can do it ourselves, I didn't see it that way. I didn't recognize that that's what I was doing in my journal.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I was 16 and I was 82 pounds, I needed to get into therapy. I'm too afraid to barf, so thank God I never did that. I would actually rather die, but um, it's harder to be anorexic, I'll tell you, because but it made me high. It made me out of my body. I was like, whoa, I was like delirious. I was so hungry. And so when I got into therapy and I felt for the first time seen, it was my first experience of that feeling.
Wow.
And I would think about my therapist all the time. Like I felt like I had a mom for the first time. And she said I wasn't the problem. I was just a symptom of the trauma. But there were no labels that were used like they are today.
Mm-hmm.
And she was with me for 5 years. And that's my first experience of being seen.
Wow.
And so I think that when you are going along and you're invisible or you're unseen or whatever, I don't want anyone to look at that as, oh gosh, that was all bad. There, if you look, there are aspects of it where you saw yourself and you helped yourself. Somehow you got you from point A to point B. Somehow it might not have been pretty.
Yeah.
But you might have had one wing, little crooked of a flight, but you still got there. So like all of my listeners, like you're here now by your own volition and your own ability to at least somehow love yourself and see yourself enough that you got here.
Absolutely. There was something that you brought up that I think is such an important aspect of, I don't know, complex trauma, surviving childhood trauma, surviving these kinds of toxic family dynamics. That's part of how we adapt to the lack of being seen or when being seen is unsafe, which is, it really is some level of dissociation, is some level of disconnection. And, you know, of course, you were talking about, which I so resonate with this, right? I think most of us get to college age and we're like, who am I? Which are, of course, normal questions to some extent at that age. But if you haven't had the experience of someone mirroring back safely who you are, you've never had the opportunity to know who is here. And that's what trauma does. All types of trauma is it disconnects you from yourself, especially if showing who yourself was externally, internally was unsafe and you were harmed emotionally or physically for it. So we disconnect, we get out of our bodies. We might just live up here, right? We might just get really intellectual about things. We might feel really disconnected from the body. And that can show up in, you know, eating disorders and drug and alcohol use. And you show up in daydreaming, right? And all sorts of levels of dissociation. And for me, as I've done my healing work, I look back and I see that that is one way that I survived so many different experiences, so many different traumas and abuses in my life, was this brilliant, brilliant part of me disconnected.
Yes.
And it's so easy for us to judge that part or, you know, of course, wish things were different or wish we could just easily reconnect now. But for everyone listening, if that's something that you struggle with in any shape or form, I really just want to reiterate, this is such a brilliant part of your system that you needed. You needed that to keep you safe, whether that was a part of you saying, be small, a part of you saying, take care of other people, a part of you saying, go somewhere else. All of that was to preserve your core self because it's there.
That's right. And we are so designed for survival. And I think it's such a gift. You know, I really love the idea of not eliminating our pain. I love acceptance commitment therapy. Unless we really go and effectively get a lobotomy, we can't eliminate our pain.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's about sitting in it or not working on it, but I think it's about not wanting to get rid of it, that it's essential, or our brains would be designed differently if we were not to remember our past. And I think that acceptance is so much harder than just forgiving or bouncing out on something that we can hang our hat on that makes us look good to society, or I'm healed, right? I don't even think of being healed. I look at it as it's much more of a verb for me because
Mhm.
I've got core wounds. And when those guys wake up, they're like little monsters in my basement. And I'm like, oh gosh, there's one of those guys. And then I have to go down and figure out where the trigger stops and the monster intersects. You have to really navigate your emotions. And I just finished writing a workbook and I'm doing it all in that framework. It's so super cute. But I wanted people to see visuals instead of having all of these terms and when it gets too clinical, I'm so tired of being reduced to a condition. She's a bad kid.
Yeah.
Be thankful she's getting it out now in her teenage years. You'll be better for it later. All of the things. She's anorexic. She's emotionally out of control. All of these, I was just always reduced to a condition. And so as much as I think labeling is good for like knowledge, I don't know how good it is for the actual healing, because me knowing my mom is how she is has not healed it for me. Okay, because I'm
Right.
still left with all of the core wounding. It's helpful.
Yeah.
I know what kind of cancer I've got, right?
Yep.
But,
Yep.
and what kind of treatment I can do, but I accept in full that I have this wounding, that I have these monsters in my basement. I can tell you all of who they are. They're actually super cute. I kind of love them. And I love going and having a visit. Like, where are we at? What crime scene box just opened? And let's unpack it. But we don't want to give the person up there the full throttle of you because they didn't create you.
Right.
We want to give them the proper amount and the proper boundary. We're not, right? So I think, learning to be grounded and is about accepting that you're always going to have triggers.
Mhm.
And almost always we are triggered when we don't feel seen.
Yes.
We wake up a monster like, oh my gosh, you just completely left a mess on my porch.
Yep.
And you did X, Y, and Z, and that hurt me. And you get, well, it's your porch.
Yep.
You're like, oh, what? Right. So now you've not been seen. You've been disrespected. You've been violated. You've been taken advantage of. Right.
Absolutely.
So there's such a great, beautiful way to have communication all throughout the inner world of who you are. Right. But you've got to know what all the parts and pieces are.
Yes.
And that's how you make sure you're seen. If someone refuses to see you, then you put them at a greater distance in your life. Like you go from the porch to the yard.
Yep. And
Like
I
you
think
don't love them less.
right. But when we haven't taken a look at what's gone on inside of us, I think this is where we get stuck and end up repeating potentially some of these patterns. Because if I've internalized from those experiences, if I've internalized all those beliefs about being a burden, should be quiet, not take up space, not being important, being unlovable, and someone gives me that experience of not being seen, I don't yet have the capacity to say, this person maybe not super healthy. What happens is I go, ooh, confirmation of me, confirmation of what I've been made to believe about myself. Now, instead of putting distance and protecting myself or just navigating differently, I need to work harder. I need to work harder to be seen or figure out how to get this person to respect me or to be loved or to stay connected, but not be a burden. And this is where we start like molding ourselves and we just become a sliver of a
we go,
human
don't
being.
worry about the mess you left on my porch. I'll clean it up.
Right.
Look at what a good cleaner I am.
Right.
Right. And I think we go through phases of that, but the body will tell you when enough is enough.
Absolutely.
Right. And you will know that when you are angry.
Yeah. Yes.
It's interesting that rage is the most misused emotion in parenting, and anger is the most punished emotion in children. So let's unpack that for a minute. That means that parents are allowed to rage on their children and their children aren't allowed to be angry about it.
Yep.
There's no justice in that.
Yep.
right? I just did a Sharepie on anger because people really misunderstand it. Anger says no. Anger says enough is enough. Anger says something needs to change.
Yes.
Anger is about justice. Rage and anger are very different, right? So I think that we go through a lot of this people pleasing, which I was like, I think I have lots of trophies for winning people pleasing competitions.
Yeah.
And they didn't help my life any to have them on the wall because they were all based in shame. And it did have me choosing all the wrong men, all the wrong friends, just even all the wrong choices for me, and lowering my self-worth, where I was treating myself as unimportant to me as my parents taught me I was to them.
Yep.
Because that's the only kind of love I knew.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only type of connection I knew
Mm-hmm.
was cruelty to me. So, and being a good girl, though, got to be a good girl. So, all of those things will wake up something in your body. And at some point, you'll start to go, this is crazy. Like, I'm literally allowing myself to do this. And that it's so terrifying to think of making any of those changes. So, what I say to my patients is, as we evolve, what has to happen too is our coping skills need to change and evolve. So, what worked for you as a child, like if I'm treating a 16-year-old who's still food, home, and shelter dependent, I will tell them to gray rock, which is essentially people pleasing.
Yep.
Because they have to live there.
Yeah.
But we would need to change that response, practice it at school, maybe. But once they're out and they have more power, then they have to recognize that people pleasing worked here, but it's going to kill them here.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
So I think that the responses we have will alert the body to, I'm going against myself.
This is so important, especially when I'm thinking back to what we touched on with disconnection and dissociation, because our bodies are so smart. They're giving us so much information constantly. When you are having to suppress yourself, parts of yourself, your voice, your authenticity, right? You're pushing down. And what that does is it's creating all this resentment and anger for us being unable to express, and for all the backlash, the punishment, the shame, everything, right? But because it's unsafe, we have to push everything down. So I think most of us have this internal experience of people pleasing and the fear of what might happen if we speak up or show ourselves, while we also have this hugely suppressed anger. And that is really hard to navigate. I absolutely struggled with that. And I think for so many of us, the pendulum, when we start to do healing, the pendulum swings, where it's like we finally start to let it out and it can feel really big and scary and explosive. But the problem is, before we get to that healing part, if we have to disconnect to survive all of that, we're disconnecting not just from our body, but from the anger. And as you're saying, the anger isn't bad, because anger is telling us, it's like helping us navigate how to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, it's the most honest of all of our emotions.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's the only emotion that will bring justice to an injustice. It is the only emotion that backs boundaries.
Yes.
We overuse fear, sadness, and anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we don't want to look angry, because we've already been labeled as bad, right? And I learned that there's a finite amount of space to which we can push things down. It will reach its end.
It will.
So we are also designed to, there is a finite amount of space to which what you can suppress will stay down.
Yeah.
And it will start leaking out. Like, you'll get mad in a car when you can be mad at a stranger, or you can be crying in a movie that's so emotional or whatnot. You can over identify with things that touch you, but you can't seem to cry about yourself. I had a hard time crying for me for a very long time, because no one ever cried for me.
Yes.
So crying for me, I had a hard time doing. But I mean, this is embarrassing, but when I was little, there was a movie called Harry and the Hendersons. It's about a Sasquatch.
I
Okay.
remember that movie.
I was sobbing in that movie when they punched Harry and they made him
Oh,
go back to I was sobbing.
oh.
And my friend was looking at me, and we're in high school, and she's like, Campbell, are you all right? Ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay. But I look back now, and there's been certain movies that have just made me just sob. No one else was crying in Harry and the Hendersons. Okay. It was me. But I cried so hard in Dances with Wolves when, in this one scene, when he had to separate from the tribe, that someone behind me handed me tissue. I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like,
Mm.
but I couldn't go home in my room and cry for me.
Yeah.
I couldn't feel bad for me. I felt I deserved what I got. Right. So I think that there's just this finite amount of space. And there was a lot of space, clearly, because it took me 4.5 decades.
Even if it doesn't leak out, your body's going to absorb it at some point.
Absolutely.
And I think I see that so much in my practice, especially with women, unfortunately, because we have all these other kind of gender cultural expectations around expression.
Yeah.
But absolutely, it's this leakage where the system naturally wants to let it out, but we're at war within ourselves. But at some point, there is a breaking point.
And what I think is interesting to kind of toggle on to that, and I love my men, so I hate ever leaving men out, but it is true that women that come from abuse, hands down, get female cancers.
Yeah.
Right. And I treat so many men that have really been horribly and horrifically abused as well. And so much focus goes on women, which I love because I am one. But I think that men also just, they leak out in different ways. And it's even harder for them and more socially unacceptable for them to cry, for them to hug one another, for them to support one another emotionally, for them to get touch. Like, they're only allowed to get that from women,
Absolutely.
not from other men. So there's a whole lot, I think, that goes on. And I think men stuff a little better and a little more black and white. And I think that they leak in a different way than women. But yes, I agree that the body will at some point find its way to pour itself into the body through illness or leakage some other way. It's men have a much higher suicide rate than women. So especially over 45. So I just think that there's just so much that goes on. And if we can listen to our bodies, and what does that mean? It means you get a gut feeling like something isn't right. Right. And when you've been hurt a lot, I think it's hard to tell the difference between fear and intuition. I think that those are hard. And so if you feel either one or the other, I just don't think you need to make a decision now. I've always thought about, as long as I'm going forward, it doesn't matter how fast. So I think of like forward is a pace. If I get the I don't know from my body, there's something going on, but I don't know, I just wait.
Sure.
I've learned to wait. And I think that, again, I think that was a superpower that I developed from my childhood, is because I just was never safe to be seen. I just waited. I learned to wait.
Yep.
Right. And to hold things in.
Yep.
I mean, it's like the skill set I learned was kind of amazing. And the way that I can utilize it today is actually helpful, not harmful, because at least now I know what I'm doing and I'm doing it consciously. So
I love that you share that, because I'm thinking back to this idea of like trying to get rid of these parts or these monsters. And I think that is the crux of it, is
keep them. They're cute.
Right. If we, first of all, if we recognize that they have a function, even if it's serving us right now, they played a role, we needed them. But more than that, like all these parts of us, no matter how gnarly they are, really just need to be seen and loved, just like that. Then it's less about getting rid of them and more about like this beautiful way you just described about how they transform into something that can be useful and aligned with your adult self now. Rather than, operating from, age 4, 5, 6, whenever they really initially developed. And we don't get the opportunity to transform those things if we're working so hard to push them away, which is what we do when we're still caught in all that shame story and cycles of feeling bad and unworthy and unlovable. Is we're if like I would be good if I could just delete this part of myself and cut it out. But
Yeah.
that is part of the healing, is seeing yourself, all parts of you, and learning to allow and see and love all those parts of you, just as a parent should have.
Right. And I think the monsters, like to me, it's like Monsters Inc. It's sort of what inspired this metaphor for me is they're all very cute. Um, they're like stuffed animal monsters in some respect. It's not about getting rid of their emotion or their reactivity. It's about going down to that basement where your monster is. He's gotten out, and you hear its side,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Then you channel the reaction, which turns into good communication or a clarity on where you want to set boundaries or how you do that. And that's what we can get into such an elimination, even no
Mm.
contact is seen as an elimination. And it's really more about protection.
Yeah.
I've never wanted to go through life just lopping off parental limbs. It wasn't ever what I wanted. It's still today not what I want. But I have to protect myself against anyone who's not going to care or protect me, right? So it's not about eliminating. I have a different form of a relationship with them. It is just not verbal and active. It is silent and inactive.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the connection I have.
Yeah.
And it is a connection.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. It just changed form.
Yeah.
It's not about hate. It's not about a lack of love. It's about I have to protect myself.
Yeah.
And so when you can kind of come in a place of wholeness and you recognize that we don't want to eliminate the very things that helped you survive. Without those reactive monsters in the basement, you wouldn't be here.
That's
Why
right.
would we ever want to go in and eliminate? We need to train them, but we don't want to eliminate them because for me, those are my gut instincts.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
they can be channeled in that respect. Like I look at them now, it's the house alarm. It's like the inbuilt house alarm. Something happens, I become ungrounded on the ground floor. Monster wakes up, the alarms are going off. I'm like, oh, something's going down in the palace of me. And I've got to figure out and go investigate what's going on. Why is the alarm going off? What's happening? What went on? And you have to go down and you have to be with that. But I would never want them not in my basement. I feel the most secure that they're there, even though they are the hardest part of me to manage, because at least I'm being alerted, even if I'm too sensitive. Okay, which I don't even believe in, but I get to go down and I get to decide that for myself.
That's right.
Did the alarm get tripped or was it real? Right. And I can tell you hands down, there's always been a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
I've never just tripped out.
Yep.
There's always been a trigger. And I feel like eliminating isn't the way.
Our culture is all about fixing. It's all about control. It's all about problem solving. And that is what we do up here.
Yes.
In this approach of acceptance, and I'll share the word willingness, which is very
Yes.
act aligned, because I think sometimes that's more digestible for people. Like, can you be willing to have these parts if it means that allowing them to be here and listening to them means that they're not running your life?
That's
Because
right.
it is that struggle. Like anytime, anything, whether it's a body sensation, an emotion, a memory, anything we try to control, get rid of, or tuck away, it grows and it grows and it grows. And it does. I know it's so paradoxical. But it's really amazing when you look across different modalities. That common
Yes.
thread among so
Yes.
many of them is, you can use different terminology, parts work, ACT, mindfulness based.
Yes.
So much of that thread is about noticing,
Noticing.
allowing, and
Yeah.
not noticing from here, not noticing our story, noticing our physiological experience of whatever's showing up,
That's
and
right.
relating to it from here.
Yep.
And I think that to me has all these threads to what we're talking about with being seen and anger and disconnection. I know for myself, when I started to reconnect to my body, which was odd for me to think about not being in my body because I was a dancer, I was a singer. There was parts of me that in some way were so connected, but so disconnected. When I started to really reconnect to my body, it's overwhelming because there was a lot of anger there, a lot of suppressed emotions and many other things. But as I've worked with it and figured out how to listen to it and let it move through me, not get stuck in the story of it, that's what's allowed me to have healthier relationships in my life, because I can listen to when that anger shows up and it's asking something of me. I'm no longer just shutting it down, but I'm not reactive to it. And that
you want a partner.
Right?
You want a partner with it.
Exactly.
Right? So I think when we partner within ourselves, is when we have the most whole experience, right? Not a perpetual state of well-being, but just it's messy sometimes. And that the mess is good. The mess is life. It's reality, right? I have to shut us down. I want to talk for 100 hours. I can't even believe it. It's incredible. You are so amazing. I love the unique way that you articulate pain, and it's so relatable. And I just, this is going to help so many people. When I saw your whole thing on Instagram about being seen, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to have her on my show. And so what would you leave with the listeners? What would you leave them with today?
I think the biggest piece is, especially if you're starting at the beginning of this, there's so many moving parts to this, but just starting, if you can just begin to see some of those fears around being seen, however they're showing up in your life now, whether it's your relationship, your work, your self-expression, your talents, however it's showing up for you, if instead of judging yourself or feeling like you have to push yourself, if you can just start with a bit of self-compassion, to recognize that this part of me that is so deathly afraid to be seen, viscerally wanting to avoid it at all costs, this is my brilliant survival resource that I needed. And once you can start to do that and start to relate to that part of you with more kindness and compassion, then you can start to do all the other things that we were talking about today. But we can't push past that and get to the end of the healing if we're not willing to honor the role that it has played for us. And I would really spend some time with that. How has it served you? How did it keep you safe? Look at all these different areas and relationships in your life. Don't focus on how it's causing you trouble now. But I think once you start to relate to those parts with some compassion, everything begins to open up.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, we're going to leave it right there. How can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram or TikTok, Dr. Denise Saidi. I also have a 6-month program called Heal the Inner Child that touches on so many of the pieces that we've talked about today.
Perfect.
So if you're looking for an introduction to these things, or you're looking to deepen your work in community, that's something you can find on my social media also.
Well, we love you. And you're also on TikTok, and I'll have all the links in the show notes for everyone to see. And this will go up on YouTube as well. And I just thank you for your time, for your voice, for your grace. I think you have such a unique way of expressing this concept, especially. And I'm so thankful for it. It's made me think about things a bit different. It actually triggered being seen and what my experience was. I've actually never written about that or talked about that. So you brought that out in me, and I appreciate you for that. And I just adore you. And thank you so much for coming on Therapy Sessions. And you guys, she's the best. Thanks for tuning in. And we will talk again in the next couple of weeks. Until then, be well. Take care of you. Well, Bravehearts, that concludes our amazing therapy session for the day. Please sign up on my email list at drsherrycampbell.com so that you can be in touch with me and see what's going on in terms of what I'm offering soon, what books are coming out, etc. Talk to you in a couple of weeks.